Before we dive into the information presented in this book, I would like to state that I'm not trying to convince you of any conclusion, nor am I trying to steer you in any direction politically. My purpose in reviewing this book is to try and pull the truth from history. From there, people are most free to make their own assessments of the world. Much as there cannot be medical consent given without the appropriate information being shared with the person, making sense of the world we find ourselves in is much the same. How are we ever expected to be able to make informed decisions if we're being misinformed? We cannot, which leads me to this book. The author offers over 1,000 footnotes building on the works of other solid characters who sought the truth, sometimes uncomfortable and sometimes leading to their lives being ended. So let us begin. The author begins this chapter, chapter 1, with a quote from Steve Kangus's article called A Timeline of CIA Atrocities. I'll now read this. Quote, "The Association for Responsible Dissent estimates that by 1987, 6 million people had died as a result of CIA covert operations. Former State Department official William Blum correctly calls this an American Holocaust. The CIA justifies these actions as part of its war against communism. But most coups do not involve a communist threat. Unlucky nations are targeted for a wide variety of reasons, not only threat to American business interests abroad, but also liberal or even moderate social reforms, political instability, the unwillingness of a leader to carry out Washington's dictates, and declarations of neutrality in the Cold War. Indeed, nothing has infuriated CIA directors quite like a nation's desire to stay out of the Cold War." End quote. The first character we're introduced to in this book is Alan Dulles. So before delving into the book itself, I want to give a little background sketch on this man. So Alan Dulles is an interesting character who tends to crop up in almost any reading of history, at least any reading that delves deeper than the carefully constructed surface reading of history that is delivered to us in sound bites. Alan Dulles and his brother John Foster Dulles were the nephews of Robert Lansing, who was the Secretary of State from 1915 to 1920 in America. And they are the grandsons of John Watson Foster, who was also the Secretary of State from 1892 to 1893 in America. According to Dulles's family biographer, Lansing was, quote, "so pro-English that he even took elocution lessons to perfect the English accent he was cultivating." Both brothers were involved in the Paris Peace Conference following the end of World War I. A graduate of Princeton University, he, along with his brother, were corporate lawyers and were partners in the Sullivan and Cromwell law firm. Sullivan and Cromwell had some interesting ties and clients, from floating bonds for the German arms manufacturer Krupp AG, in addition to managing the finances of the German chemical and pharmaceutical company IG Farben, which would be on trial for war crimes in Nuremberg, as they were said to be the company that produced the chemical Zyklon B, which was said to be used in the concentration camps. Sullivan and Cromwell were for decades, quote from the New York Times, were for decades an important link between big business and American policy making. Back to Alan Dulles. In 1921, he was posted to Bern in Switzerland, where he took up the role of Chief of Intelligence. According to the author Jim Keat, the Dulles family, through Alan's uncle, were married into the Mallet Prévost family, an old Huguenot banking family based in Geneva. In addition to this work, in 1927, Dulles became the first president of the Council on Foreign Relations, or the CFR, whose body was made up of some of the leading bankers, industrialists, and high-ranking government officials in America. The CFR was purposed with engineering a policy of US interventionism in order to, quote, "make the world safe for democracy." We may take a deeper look at the CFR another day, but for now let us return to Alan Dulles. Dulles would also serve on the board, later becoming director of the Schroeder Bank. This bank was said to play a role in pre-World War II Germany, for in his book Aggression, Otto Lehmann Roosevelt tells us that, quote, "Hitler was invited to a meeting at the Schroeder Bank in Berlin on January 4, 1933. The leading industrialists and bankers of Germany tided Hitler over his financial difficulties and enabled him to meet the enormous debt he had incurred in connection with the maintenance of his private army. In return, he promised to break the power of the trade unions. On May 2, 1933, he fulfilled his promise. End quote. Schroeder Bank were represented by Sullivan and Cromwell, which were led by the Dulles brothers, who were said to be at this meeting with Hitler in 1933. And so we can see from these few pieces of Dulles's interesting life that he was heavily entrenched in the world of geopolitics, international law, and international intelligence. This little background brings us close to where Williams takes up his story. In 1942, Allen Dulles, as the Swiss director of the US Office of Strategic Services, or the OSS, which was a precursor to the CIA, declared that, quote, "We are fighting the wrong enemy," end quote. Dulles received word from the SS chief Heinrich Himmler and the head of SS Foreign Intelligence Service Walter Schellenberg, courtesy of Vatican messengers, that the Nazi government wished to establish a separate peace with the United States. Dulles was open to this and met with a Prussian aristocrat, Prince Max von Hohenlohe, in Bern, Switzerland. Dulles viewed this proposal as a means to fighting the oncoming Russian or Bolshevik force. William Wild Bill Donovan, who at the time was the OSS chief in Washington, learned of Dulles's desire to pursue the peace negotiations with the Nazi Party, as he, Dulles, viewed the Soviets as posing a, quote, "far greater threat to the United States and to the stability of the Western world than the Nazis." Williams cites the Nazis' belief in private property as a contributing factor in Dulles's conclusion in developing a working relationship with the Nazis against the oncoming Bolsheviks into Europe. Dulles subsequently then began to conduct meetings with Nazi General Reinhard Gehlen in Bern, Switzerland. Gehlen suggested the idea of developing, quote, "stay-behind units," which would be composed of the Hitler Youth and die-hard fascists. He termed these werewolves, as they would blend in with the local populations by day, and by night they would be communist killers. These werewolves would have access to buried depots of food, radio equipment, weapons, and explosives. Dulles, apparently fearing a Soviet invasion of Europe, worked with Gehlen and SS General Karl Wolff in establishing these stay-behind units. This separate peace deal between the Nazis and the United States became Operation Sunrise, where 3 Nazi divisions were moved from northern Italy and sent to the Eastern Front to combat the Soviets. In 1945, following the war, the redrawing of the European map would see the Soviets take control of eastern Germany and part of Poland. The remainder of Germany would be divided into 4 zones of occupation: England, France, America, and the Soviets. This was part of the Yalta Agreement. Following the Soviets' capture of eastern Germany, Dulles then took Gehlen and his representatives to Fort Hunt in Virginia, where they met William Wild Bill Donovan and other US officials. The resulting agreement would see Gehlen return to Germany under US protection, where he would establish the Gehlen Organization, funded by the US Army, G2 Intelligence. The Gehlen Organization would maintain and develop additional stay-behind units who would fight against the encroaching communists and would become known as gladiators. Thus, Operation Gladio was born. Another OSS official involved in these stay-behind units was James Jesus Angleton. Williams suggests this man to have been a, quote, "rabid anti-communist, an ardent Anglophile, and a devout Roman Catholic." Angleton's father Hugh was also part of the OSS and had developed contacts in Italy, such as Prince Giunio Valerio Borghese, a member of the Catholic black nobility, Italian aristocrats who remained loyal to the Vatican. Borghese was the leader of an Italian naval commando unit who, following the 1943 armistice between Italy and the Allies, went on to fight for the, quote, "Solo Republic," which had been set up by the Nazis in northern Italy. The enemy for this Solo Republic were partisan bands, which were sponsored by the Italian Communist Party. Borghese, in April of 1945, met with Angleton and Wolff and agreed to extend their fighting beyond any potential peace treaty with the Soviets. His unit would now fall under the covert direction of the OSS. Angleton and Bill Donovan came to the realization that Borghese and his fascist unit could be used to work behind the scenes of the Italian political arena as a shadow government. The US State Department mandated that the resources for the Italian police, military intelligence, and the Secret Service would be placed at the disposal of Angleton and the SCI, which was the secret counterintelligence unit of the OSS. Under Borghese, the forces of Gladio were split into 40 main groups, 10 specializing in sabotage, 6 each in espionage, propaganda, escape tactics, and 12 in guerrilla activities. Trained in a camp in Sardinia, by 1946, when the OSS morphed into the Central Intelligence Group, there were now hundreds of Gladio stay-behind units throughout Western Europe. Funding. As Gladio was a covert operation and had not been initiated by an act of the American Congress, funding would need to be sourced from elsewhere. Its original funding of $200 million from the Rockefeller and Mellon foundations was in need of replenishment. Where that money would come from is the subject of the next chapter. So to summarize what we've learned. We've learned that members of the OSS, or American intelligence, began covert work in tandem with former Nazi members to develop guerrilla stay-behind units who would serve to wage war against communists in Europe.